Falcons have been an unmitigated disaster in CS2. Now, we know their ambitions coming into the scene. We've seen where the money comes from. We know who they've tried to sign, and the fact that they haven't been able to get those pieces tells us a lot. The results that have followed with the rosters they have settled for just haven't been good enough. And we're not talking about a G2 level of not good enough. G2 settling for second place, the occasional win at not quite the biggest events, the occasional period where you do win a couple prestige events, but never the major, never the Grand Slam, never having an era defined around you. That's G2's level of failure. Falcons haven't reached that. They haven't even come close to it, despite having clear ambitions to absolutely dominate. They've been closer to OG than G2, and that is an insane thing to have to say, given what they could be doing. Now, we know that Falcons, or at least those who sit way back in the shadows above everything, but definitely control this team, want to be the best. That's why we have the Esports World Cup, lest we forget, and that's why they tried to give themselves that huge trophy to try and build some prestige around their brand. In CS2, they've utterly failed to do this, despite actually being quite successful in other games. So I'm going to go back to the start, talk about what they've done and why it's been a mess, and where they are now. This video is of course coming right off the back of them announcing that they are benching Dupree, Snappy, and Madden. They are essentially currently left with Magisk, as they're not extending Simple's loan. So where did this all start? Well, we can go back roughly... Well, we can go back quite a way if we go back far enough. There is Falcons who played basically mixed European, Middle Eastern sort of rosters to try and make it into Blast. But I start with the French roster, because the French roster was just a team that needed an org. They provided one. It was sort of the thing where you take these guys in and maybe you see if any of them have some potential. When you do go finally do your big plan, you can escape the holding pattern, but potentially keep a couple of these more skilled, potentially tier 1 players. What ended up happening is they ended up getting into a bit of a pickle. They end up keeping Body and MBK and signing 3 young fraggers to try and make things work. It wasn't the worst idea, and on paper, if you're a tier 2 watcher, you think all these players have a lot of potential, maybe there is something brewing. In the end, these guys ended up quite simply disappointing. They played a lot of tier 2 cups, a lot of online play, not being good enough to really win, have that dominant period. Some teams, they go into tier 2, they win so much that they end up making more prize money than legit tier 1 sides who just have the invites but don't ever really perform. Historically, an example might be Evil Geniuses. They had all the partnership slots. They'd earn less in a year than, say, 500, who won every single tier 2 cup almost and earned shit tons off the back of it. That was not this Falcons roster. So Zonic comes in. They finally make the big signings starting to happen. And Zonic decides, we publicly hear about this. Oh, these players all have a chance to stay on the roster. We all looked at each other. It's that classic just... Ain't no way. There's no way you, 4-time major winner, are coming in and you're going to settle for a lot of these players. Magisk was quick to follow. That was pretty much announced, but officially doesn't get made happen for a little bit. And the roster they end up building, because they have these ideas, they have these desires, they want to go sign Nico, they want to go make this huge super team. They end up signing the core events in Snappy, Madden, Sun Pius. They actually do keep one of their young players. I've heard some people suggest maybe it's just because he's more from the Middle East region, they want to keep it regional. I don't think so. I think it's genuinely because they believed he was actually a talent. I believe he's a talent, at least back then, and now to this day. He still acts like he's just a talent, from what I've heard, but at least the raw aim is there. Boros is still a fragger. So they do end up with this roster of Magisk, Madden, Snappy, Sunpius, Boros. And initially, it's a bit of a weird idea. You've got Snappy coming in with his very clear set ideas of how he likes to play. Zonic has built the roster, but he's not, at least officially, hyper dictating what needs to be done on the server. He's more leaving that up to Snappy on how to run the game. But still, there's his influence in Magisk being on the roster. It's a bit weird, it doesn't quite mesh, but they do get some good results straight out the bat. At Katowice, they make a top 4 run. They do get a couple of legit wins. Let me just whip out the notes, because I've not got a script for this. I'm just going off the top of the dome, but I do have some links open. Yeah, so at Katowice, they're able to beat Navi. They're able to beat Complexity. They beat Ents, who had their full Polish run straight to the semi-final, to the quarterfinals, sorry. And then they fall down to Spirit, who were in on insane form. We all remember that spirit. So it's an actually impressive run, and it's starting to look like the idea might work. You know, you've not got tons of firepower across the roster, but you have solid play, a tactical idea, and players who play the right way and have played like that at a high level for years. You know, just experienced veterans and a kind of wild card in Boros. The problem is it starts falling apart very quickly. We start hearing bad things about Boros's behavior, antics off the server. You know, we all get that leaked video from, I think it's around the time of the RMR is when the video's from, but it's actually released to us a much later date. But still, that's when we start getting confirmation of the things we hear, we rumored, and then he ends up getting benched, and that later confirms everything why. The problem is then you need to replace Boros's firepower. He was one of the few things that could actually break the system on this team. He's one of the few players who could consistently take a hard duel and win it, you know? Go head to head with someone, bang their head off, then still have a chance to make a multi happen. There is no one else on this team who really matched him in terms of multi-kill rate, big openings. No one else was really equipped to do it. So when they lost him, they needed that big replacement, and they end up signing Dupree, which was like the best of terrible situations they could, like, this is mid-season. There isn't a lot of player movement. There's just, for Falcons, an old reliable player who's also looking for a team who's been kind of in Danish Tier 2 CS and making a decent go of it. Dupree at this point, we have to remember, on Heroic and on Prezi online, put up some great numbers. The problem is, they sign him. He's actually surprisingly decent for a few events. Not great at all of them, but he has a couple standouts. Jönköping, they end up finishing second. He's got like a 0.9 KPI. You think, okay, that's what they signed him for. It's just as we go deeper into the season, months after months go by, he can't replicate it. And you end up with a roster with, to be fair, 4 duds in terms of firepower. Because Magisk, whilst we do all think he still has a place on this team, should have a place on this team, and is able to turn it on, he hasn't really been amazing at every event. He's had a lot of events that were mediocre. I mean, and he does play less classic impact positions, so we don't really expect him to have great numbers all the time. It's not necessary for winning the game, but it's definitely a factor. With the fact that Sampaio struggles, you know, eventually he gets benched. We bring in Simple. An idea, let's put it that way, that's an idea. But Sampaio, if you actually dig into the numbers, you'll take a look, you'll see Sampaio isn't trash. He's just not a superstar AWPer, which was a bit awkward, a bit puzzling, because whilst we don't expect him to be necessarily on the m0NESY Zywoo level, when he was playing under Snappy in ENCE, he was able to have those sort of like 1.23 rated events where he's finding a lot of multis, being more active on the opening side, actually very involved in the action and getting things done. He was neutered on this Falcons, but still put up, I think, a lot of respectable performances. They took a massive gamble bringing Simple in, essentially trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We cut an AWPer who isn't a superstar. We try to fill in our firepower void with the player we put there. So you're expecting Simple to be a great AWPer and also be a dominant force. It was a pipe dream considering how long he'd been out the game. I believed in it a bit. I put out a tweet saying, look, Falcons lose a lot of their games in very close fashion. If you get 80% of Prime Simple, that's with consistency, that's better, far better than what some players have been on Falcons, despite me saying he wasn't garbage. 80 to 90% of Prime Simple is crazy good. If you get that, there's a chance they actually can be a relevant team. Not one that's devoid of any criticism and can't make any roster moves to get better, but certainly a far more promising roster that's not as in major trouble as the one we currently see. So now what do they do? This is the interesting discussion, because they've made roster moves over and over again, I think, not randomly, but based on things that I don't think are quite important enough. They've prioritized in the past experience, name brand value, having won tournaments, but they have very much forgotten that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how well you communicate, doesn't matter how good the strat is, doesn't matter how many events you've won in the past, if you can't just frag out, you can't hit the headshots, you're going to struggle in the modern era of Counter-Strike. In terms of what the future holds, we know Nico's coming. That's essentially a confirmed thing. They have Magisk, they have Nico. They have, on paper, their most solid rifle core ever. Like, I'm even talking the Boros era where they made top 4 at Kato. That's Boros and a bunch of guys playing solid Counter-Strike. This is stronger than that. Nico, as your top-end talent, is still one of the best rifles in the world. I mean, top 3, top 4, at worst. Even if he takes a dip coming in Falcons, like a lot of players seem to, that's the worst-case scenario. We do have to answer the question, who's going to be calling, who's going to be leading, and who's going to be AWPing. But I think there are some places they can go with this. With the money they can throw around, essentially, at this point, and with some of the performances we're likely to see at these RMRs, a lot of the teams that are going to be disappointed, teams who are going to overperform, they should be able to assemble some solid pieces. I just hope they avoid the pitfalls they've hit before, which is to say, overly betting on experience to just get you through, relying on things that used to work, rather than looking for things that are currently on the rise. The idea of m0NESY following Nico to this roster is still very appealing. Think about it. Magisk potentially on the IGL, under Zonic, Nico's your star rifler, m0NESY is your star AWPer. Sure, you've just ripped G2 to absolute tatters. There's nothing left of that roster almost at this point. You have to fully rebuild around Snax, Hunter, Malbs. No offense to Snax, no offense to Hunter, and hell, no offense to Taz. I would be, if I'm G2, fully rebuilding at that point. I'm cutting all of them. I've got Malbs as a young player. I'm going to start looking for real talents, prospects, undervalued players that I can sign and bring in to try and rebuild over the course of the next season, to try and then dominate in the fall season of 2025. But on the Falcons front, at that point, I think you can almost sign anyone. Not literally anyone, because if you do start signing Get Right and Forest at this point, you're probably going to struggle. But think about the top-end talent you have. Think about all the places you can go in terms of finding fill players, finding supportive roles, just filling out the roster. You could do it a number of different ways and be more successful than this Falcons roster has been over the last 6 months. If you get it completely wrong, you may not reach even that Kato top 4 level. But goddamn, you have a lot of margin for error if you're willing to pay the money and take a risk on a few younger players. But yeah, this is a quick video just to chart the moves they've made, why they made them, and how it went wrong. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts of who they should bring in, how this roster could work. And yeah, if you liked it, leave a like. Sub if you want to see more, and members get extra content, more rights, and all that good stuff. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.